before written history. Someone carved vast rooms into Georgia's cliffs and raised sanctuaries in places that feel impossibly remote. Who were they? Why these landscapes, these river crossings, these high plateaus, these sheer faces of stone? And how many hidden layers still lie beneath the monuments we see today? Every carving, every collapsed wall, every buried foundation holds a faint outline of a past still waiting to be understood. Vardzia rises in the sun-washed cliffs of southern Georgia, like a hollowed horizon of entrances and shadow chambers. At first glance, its tiered facade seems almost accidental, scattered across the volcanic tuff as though formed by erosion. But as the eye adjusts, intention replaces coincidence. Precise rhythms of carved cells, terraces, and corridors reveal themselves, threading the mountainside like the remnants of a vast, forgotten hive. The initial impression is one of quiet immensity, a feeling that the mountain has been persuaded, not conquered, into human shape. Stepping closer, the irregular dissolves into the unmistakable order of a medieval monastic world pushed deep into stone. Archaeology traces the greatest expansion of Vardzia to the 12th century, during the flourishing of the Kingdom of Georgia and the monastic culture associated with Queen Tamar. Yet the oldest cavities cut into the cliff hint at earlier phases of solitary hermitage, their forms softened by centuries of wind, rain, and seismic tremors that blur the boundary between recorded history and what came before it. Inside, tunnels twist into darkness before opening suddenly into pockets of light, where ceilings are collapsed, revealing the sky. Soot-darkened niches speak to long cycles of occupation punctuated by raids, earthquakes, and the slow erosion still shaving the cliff's face. Water continues to move through channels carved with remarkable foresight, evidence of a planning sophistication often overshadowed by the monumental exterior. The subterranean vaults, stairways, and storage systems suggest that Vardzia was conceived not only as a spiritual retreat, but as a vertical stronghold, an entire town hidden within a bluff of malleable volcanic stone. Pottery fragments, metalwork, and the fragile frescoes in the Church of the Dormition tied the complex to the cultural richness of Tamar's reign. Yet these tangible artifacts only deepen the mystery when set against the sheer scale of excavation. The labor and engineering required to hollow hundreds of chambers imply a population far larger and more organized than surviving records describe. Questions multiply. Pathways that seem older than the main complex, chambers with uncertain purpose, tunnels extending toward areas still unmapped, hinting that a deeper, older core may lie behind the later expansions. Seismological evidence points to cycles of tectonic disturbance that could have erased entire sections. Geological studies of the tuff show that ancient artisans understood the stone's differing layers, its strong strata, its brittle seams, and deliberately selected elevations that later builders merely inherited. Some scholars believe the earliest hermit cells may follow patterns seen across the wider Caucasus, where isolated ascetic dwellings predate formal monasteries by centuries. But chronology dissolves under the weight of time, altered by repairs, collapses, and reuse. As evening shadows gather, the galleries recede into the cliff, leaving the impression of a monument only partly revealed, an ongoing conversation between human devotion and an ever-shifting mountain. Uplisike, carved into a wind-swept promontory above the Mgvime River, reveals itself more gradually. From afar, it looks like a loose scatter of cavities softened by weather. But as one approaches, the landscape resolves into a sprawling rock-cut city whose contours hover between natural formation and purposeful design. The earliest phases seem to stretch so far into prehistory that even the words used to describe them feel inadequate. Approach from the river plain, the settlement rises in rippling terraces marked by entrances rounded smooth by centuries of sun and frost. Walkways begin to emerge from the lichen-dusted stone, and the whole complex assumes the feel of an open-air labyrinth shaped by a slow dialogue between geology and human intention. Excavations reveal layers of occupation spanning from the early Iron Age to the medieval period, but the deeper one looks, the more ambiguous those layers become. Shrines may echo Bronze Age ritual landscapes. Storage pits carved into bedrock refuse to settle into a clear timeline. Drainage channels linger in a simplicity that resists easy classification. The so-called Street of the Prince cuts through the settlement, a sloping artery carved directly into stone. It passes ceremonial platforms and vaulted halls where the ceilings preserve the ripple marks of ancient chisels, signatures of craftsmen long vanished. Open courtyards imply communal life, while narrow chambers pull inward, inviting speculation about functions that shifted through centuries of adaptation. Geological surveys of the outcrop show layered volcanic deposits that fracture in predictable ways, and it becomes clear that the earliest builders understood this landscape intimately. They knew which layers supported weight and which would be carved without collapse. A knowledge accumulated not through writing, but generations of careful observation. Yet the same durability blurs the site's chronological seams. Medieval renovations merge into older foundations. Collapsed ceilings mimic natural erosion, and patterns of shrines complicate attempts to identify specific religious phases. The presence of both pagan features and the later Christian basilica hints at a long-standing sacred tradition, each era reshaping what it inherited rather than replacing it. Pottery sherds and metal fragments help anchor certain periods, but vast portions, especially in the lower eastern terraces, remain undated, their architectural lines softened into ambiguity by the river winds. Semicircular chambers open toward Mgvime like eroded shells, suggestive but undecided. Habitation, storage, ritual, or something that no longer has a modern analog. Some researchers draw parallels to early Caucasian rock shelters that predate complex settlements, proposing that Upper may have begun as a cluster of seasonal dwellings before rising into a regional center. But the exposed conditions preserve little organic material, limiting certainty. Contradictions pile up quietly. Stairways that seem to lead nowhere until shifting sunlight reveals faint ledges. Wine presses carved into stone whose very simplicity obscures their era. Water channels that still function, even though no surviving record explains the system that once maintained them. Even the defensive features, ramparts, lookout posts, narrow access routes, offer more questions than answers. How much belongs to the medieval city described in chronicles? How much to earlier inhabitants responding to threats no longer remembered? Both Vardsey and Upper stand as immense dialogues between people and stone, sites where time obscures intention, where reuse erases origin, and where every answer generates another question. Their earliest builders remain unfixed in history, their names lost, their stories dissolved. But the landscapes they shaped still speak, carved with traces of belief, adaptation, and persistence that reach back into a past deeper than the first written words. As the afternoon sun drifts across the plateau, the recessed chambers brighten and dim in sequence, revealing the fluidity of their carved forms. In these shifting patterns of light and shadow, it becomes clear that Upper is not a fixed ruin, but an evolving palimpsest in stone. Each generation carved, widened, repurposed, or abandoned spaces according to needs now only faintly recognizable. What remains is a settlement whose identity cannot be confined to a single era, part sanctuary, part fortress, part urban experiment, reshaped over more than a millennium. Its earliest intentions lie partially preserved in rock, yet obscured by the very permanence that allowed the site to survive. When dusk settles along the river and wind coils through the hollow corridors, the city seems to fold into the landscape, leaving only an impression of an ancient center balance between memory and geology, its origins grounded in evidence, yet always receding just beyond the edge of recorded history. Southward along Georgia's semi-arid frontier, where rolling steppe meets broken ridges of sedimentary rock, the David Cave complex emerges as a constellation of monasteries dispersed across a worn and wind-etched landscape. A honeycomb of chambers runs along cliffs that catch shifting light in muted bands of gold and ash. At first glance, the setting appears austere. Low shrubs rattling in the wind, long slopes grooved by centuries of runoff, and no immediate signs of habitation. Yet from this sparseness, entrances to Lavra, Udabno, Dodo's Rka, and other monastic clusters reveal deliberate interventions in the earth. Natural hollows enlarged by hand, or cavities carved entirely anew, form chapels, refectories, sleeping cells, and meditative chambers whose silence persists across centuries. Archaeological and historical sources trace the foundation of the complex to the 6th century, during the spread of ascetic traditions across the Caucasus. But the land carries deeper traces of human passage, scattered tools, faint hearts, and weathered paths suggesting pastoral or hermetic activity long before the monastic communities took shape. Chronology blurs in the harsh highland climate, where organic material rarely survives. Inside the caves, fragments of fresco survive in uneven layers, some vibrant with color, others reduced to pale outlines. These overlapping pigments hint at cycles of renewal, theological debate, and artistic exchange, while half-finished scenes point to abrupt interruptions, political upheavals, invasions, or environmental strain that left chambers abandoned and later revived. Geological surveys show that the region's sandstone and siltstone fracture along predictable bedding plains, explaining both the ease with which ancient monks carved their sanctuaries and the vulnerability that has led to collapses, slumping ceilings, and softened architectural edges. The rock records as much loss as preservation, erasing traces with each season's freeze-thaw cycle and complicating efforts to reconstruct earlier phases of occupation. Among the more puzzling features are sharply angled drainage channels threading between clusters of cells. Their precision suggests coordinated planning, though it remains unclear whether they were conceived in a single organized effort or accumulated through generations of practical adaptation. Niches carved in several chambers add to the ambiguity, possibly storage, possibly devotional, while ledges overlooking the step raise questions about whether they serve as lookout points or simply places of contemplation. Contradictions emerge throughout the complex, the ideal of ascetic isolation intertwined with signs of communal life. Wine presses carved into bedrock, water systems engineered to gather scarce rainfall, and footpaths worn deep by repeated passage all point to sustained habitation, even as a remote setting reflects a conscious retreat from worldly concerns. Historical records describe episodes of destruction during invasions in the 13th and 17th centuries, yet the archaeological traces reveal not only loss but adaptation. Later occupants reinforced chambers, added annexes, or cut ceiling entrances to improve defensibility. In some sectors, blackened ceilings mark prolonged use of open fires. In others, minimal soot suggests brief or specialized occupation. Such differences hint at internal hierarchies or diverse roles within monastic life, though the specifics remain elusive. As evening light fades across the ridge and the wind threads into carved recesses, the complex seems to hover between exposure and concealment. Its open facades face the steppe, while inner corridors recede into shadow. Standing before these worn yet enduring structures, one senses a layered history shaped by devotion, but punctuated by older, less documented human activity. A sequence of adaptations formed as much by the land's demands as by the beliefs of those who sought solitude here. The David Garaja complex remains a landscape of endurance and introspection, where evidence and absence coexist and where the earliest human choices, partly preserved, partly erased, continue to leave quiet traces along the cliffs, pointing to a past extending beyond the reach of written memory. Rising abruptly from the forested valley of Meridi, the Kachki pillar stands as a solitary limestone monolith whose stark verticality defies the gentle contours of the surrounding hills. A geological sentinel shaped by erosion long before human hands found a way to reach its summit. The pillar appears from a distance like an isolated tower carved by nature. Wind and rain have smoothed its surfaces, rounding edges and deepening fissures that trace across at height. But as one comes nearer, subtle marks of human presence appear. Rope-scarred access points, narrow stairways, and the silhouette of a small hermitage rebuilt in more recent centuries on top of older, fragmentary foundations. Medieval references to ascetic life atop the pillar are sparse, suggesting a long tradition of spiritual retreat that may predate written records. Archaeologists attempt to bridge the gaps through masonry fragments, tool marks along the cliff face, and remnant of earlier structures uncovered in surveys of the summit and its concealed caves. Geological analysis shows that the pillar is the last remnant of a larger karst formation, shaped through the gradual dissolution of limestone and the collapse of surrounding rock. Its stability is both remarkable and precarious, with bedding plains and fissures offering potential routes for early climbers, while complicating modern attempts to reconstruct how the first ascent was achieved. At the base of the pillar, a modest monastic compound gathers in its shadow. Excavated materials, pottery sherds, iron fittings, fragments of masonry, suggest recurrent cycles of habitation shaped by shifts in regional religious life and episodes of conflict. Atop the pillar, the hermitage's stone chapel and living quarters occupy every workable patch of level ground. Their construction mirrors the geology below, using limestone blocks sourced from nearby outcrops. Beneath these structures, shallow depressions hint at earlier building phases worn beyond clear interpretation. Contradictions appear quietly within the archaeological record. The summit's extremely limited surface suggests only intermittent use, yet the carefully engineered cisterns and drainage channels imply longer periods of habitation that required coordination and maintenance. The preserved wooden beams of later buildings demonstrate practical monastic craftsmanship, while deeper recesses marked by weathered tool cuts point to earlier interventions whose dates resist precise classification. The result is a site suspended between natural monument and human aspiration, a vertical refuge shaped by generations who sought solitude on a pillar formed by geological time itself. Some scholars have noted parallels between Kachki and ancient Caucasian traditions of high place devotion, though such comparisons remain cautious, rooted more in the patterns of regional sacred geography than in direct evidence. Even so, the idea that the pillar may have held symbolic or ritual significance before medieval hermits climbed it lingers as a quiet possibility shaped by the broader cultural landscape of the region. The question of how early ascetics reached the summit persists not through speculation, but through close reading of the rock itself. A few isolated foothold cuttings appear in positions that suggest deliberate modification, though they do not align with later known access routes. Whether these marks represent genuine early paths or geological fractures misread by hopeful interpretation remains unresolved. In the late afternoon, as long shadows stretch across the valley and the upper chapel catches the fading light, the pillar takes on the stillness of an architectural form despite being entirely geological. The hermitage becomes a thin veil of human presence layered onto a monolith shaped over millennia. Kachki Pillar occupies a threshold where natural history and spiritual intention meet, without disclosing the sequence that bound them together. Its story is preserved only in fragments, faint tool marks, scattered finds, a tradition of devotion anchored to a foundation far older than its recorded past. As evening settles and the pillar stands alone against deepening blue, its enduring stone and sparse historical traces leave not a mystery invented, but a history partially veiled by time, a reminder how a single vertical remnant of an ancient landscape came to hold concentrated meaning long before its story was fully written. Set on a gentle slope above the Tskhaltsila River, Galati Monastery emerges not as a refuge carved from rock or a defensive outpost, but as an intentional architectural composition placed within a landscape chosen for clarity of light and the quiet rise of surrounding hills. Its stone facades embody the vision of learning and devotion shaped under King David IV in the early 12th century. At first sight, the complex appears fully rooted in its medieval context, its main church defined by balanced proportions, confident vaulting, and a harmonious integration of arches and piers. Yet scattered pottery fragments, reused stones embedded within later walls, and terraces whose origins remain uncertain hint at an earlier rhythm of occupation on the same slope, though erosion and renovation have obscured much of that earlier sequence. The placement of the Church of the Virgin, the Academy, and the bell tower feels deliberate, aligned with subtle changes in terrain that suggest familiarity with the site long before formal construction began. These possibilities remain tentative, grounded in surface archaeology rather than speculation. Inside the main church, the murals retain impressive vibrancy where moisture has spared them, their layers revealing stylistic evolution and careful restoration. Beneath worn sections, faint underdrawings appear, hinting at earlier compositions and revisions, while gaps in the painted cycle raise unsettled questions about whether certain scenes were left unfinished or later removed during structural repairs now lost to the record. The Academy, once a renowned center of philosophical and theological study, stands nearby in partial ruin. Its sequence of building phases is visible in the differing textures of masonry, from finely carved ashlars to hastily set blocks, marking periods of expansion, contraction, and repair corresponding to the shifting intellectual fortunes of the monastery. Geological assessments show that local limestone and sandstone were quarried from nearby ridges. The precision of certain blocks reflects well-established craftsmanship, yet occasional inconsistencies in tooling indicate that multiple workshops or periods of renovation became layered into the complex's long life. Water management systems surrounding the precinct reveal a thoughtful engagement with seasonal runoff, with channels aligned in natural contours. But later agricultural reshaping and soil accumulation have hidden portions of the network, leaving its full extent uncertain. Subtle contradictions surface in interpretations of the earliest phases. While written history firmly anchors Galati to its 12th century foundation, reused stones and soil disturbances beneath some structures imply earlier activity. No clear pre-monastic complex has been identified, but the traces remain suggestive. The monastery's role as a royal necropolis further complicates its chronology. Some burials are securely dated, while others remain ambiguous due to disturbed layers and centuries of movement within the grounds. Even the famed bronze door of the main church holds small puzzles. Slight variations in patina and metallurgical composition indicate repairs or partial replacements, though the timeline of these interventions remains a matter of debate. As late afternoon light slides across the cloister and glints on the tiled roofs, the monastery reveals a subtle interplay of preservation and loss. Manuscripts once copied here, now dispersed across distant libraries, echo the intellectual life that once flourished within these walls. Beneath this wealth of medieval history lies a quieter uncertainty about how the site's earlier significance may have shaped its later form, a history felt more in the ground's anomalies and reused stones than in any surviving text. When evening descends and the courtyard dims, Galati appears not only as an architectural achievement of the high medieval period, but as a layered landscape where deliberate construction rests atop traces of older, partially erased human presence. Within the broad valley of Mskita, where the Mgvare and Aragvi rivers converge in a slow, reflective sweep, Svetskavli Cathedral rises from an elevated precinct that has drawn communities for thousands of years. Its 11th century form stands atop a palimpsest of earlier sacred spaces, their outlines still detectable in fragmented foundations, worn paving stones, and archaeological layers that trace human activity deep into antiquity. Approached through the narrow streets of the old town, the cathedral appears calm and composed, its sandstone blocks absorbing and reflecting the shifting hues of the sky. Yet beneath this measured harmony lies a complex sequence of earlier shrines, basilicas, and ritual structures that once occupied the same ground. Excavations have uncovered the remains of 4th century basilica and traces of older Christian enclosures, along with pottery that suggests continuous settlement before formal ecclesiastical buildings took shape. The present cathedral, completed under the master builder Arsacids in 1029, displays proportional clarity and a subtle elongation along its east-west axis. But inside its walls, variations in stonework point to multiple phases of building and repair, shifts in mortar composition, uneven joints, and slight asymmetries in arches shaped by restoration efforts following invasions and earthquakes. The flooring reveals a similar complexity. Beneath the worn slabs lie earlier floors, crypts, and foundation trenches, their boundaries blurred by repeated reconfiguration. Excavation within the precinct has revealed stone-lined pits, remnants of tile-roof drainage channels, and portions of earlier boundary walls whose alignments do not coincide with the current layout, suggesting that the sacred orientation of the site has changed over time, adapting to new liturgical and political contexts. Inside, frescoes manifest in alternating zones of survival and disappearance. Vibrant sections glow where environmental conditions have been stabilized, while large areas remain bare, smoothed by past repairs or gradual moisture damage. Beneath certain surviving layers, conservators have identified faint traces of older pigments, nearly erased but still present, indicating sequences of repainting that accompanied shifts in artistic practice and doctrinal emphasis. These palimpsests complicate reconstruction of the cathedral's earliest visual program, for each surviving layer floats above others only partially preserved, and the gaps between them resist definitive interpretation. The celebrated stone carving of Arsacid's right hand on the cathedral's exterior wall, an image whose meaning has never been conclusively explained, captures the selective survival of memory. Some regard it as a signature of a master mason, others as a symbolic reference tied to a lost narrative. Whatever its original purpose, it stands as a reminder that meaning often outlasts context only in fragments. Geological studies of the sandstone used in the cathedral reveal quarrying from nearby outcrops along the Mgvare Valley, the blocks bearing bedding patterns typical of sedimentary stone. Weathering over the centuries have produced subtle variations across the facade. Early blocks exhibit deeper erosion, while those inserted during later repairs retain sharper edges and younger surfaces. Close examination of the lower courses shows tooling marks inconsistent with 11th century practices, indicating the incorporation of stone salvage from earlier structures. Whether this reuse reflected practical concerns or a desire to preserve older sacred materials remains unresolved. The surrounding grounds hold ambiguities of their own. The present defensive walls and gate system belong to much later phases, yet scattered masonry fragments to the north and east point toward earlier enclosures now buried beneath layers of urban development and sediment. Contradictions in the archaeological record arise from quiet irregularities rather than dramatic discoveries. Foundations varying unexpectedly in depth, column bases no longer perfectly aligned with reconstructed superstructures, and soil layers containing mixed material from disparate centuries as a result of repeated excavation, repair, and shifting ground conditions. Natural processes complicate the picture further. Seasonal flooding from the twin rivers may have deposited silt that mingled with cultural debris, blurring the stratigraphy beneath the nave and resisting firm chronological boundaries. Light entering through high windows touches carved capitals whose motifs combine local traditions with broader medieval influences. Some remain sharply defined. Others have eroded into near abstraction, the softened surfaces hinting at phases of exposure before roofing or plastering offer protection. The cathedral's acoustics, shaped by the dome and by centuries of incremental structural adjustments, carry a residual echo even when the space is quiet, an effect produced as much by accumulated change as by original design. In certain corners, uneven floor levels suggest earlier ground surfaces or gradual settling of the soil below. Structural studies provide geological explanations, yet they also reveal how deeply the building is fused with the complex history of its foundations. As dusk settles over Mesquita and the rivers fade into dark reflective bands, the cathedral's stone absorbs a diminishing light, revealing shallow depressions left by countless hands over generations. In this twilight, Svetitskovly appears not as a singular moment in architecture, but as a convergence of structures, communities, and rituals layered across millennia. Its medieval identity remains secure, yet the deeper foundations, fragments of older walls, hints of expanded precincts, artifacts embedded under floors, suggest a sacred lineage extending far beyond what written history captures. As the final light fades along the confluence, the building seems to draw its long chronology inward, leaving only the quiet suggestion that within its carefully studied stone still lie elements of a past not yet fully understood. Set high on the crest of Ucumirione Hill overlooking Kutisi, Bagrati Cathedral rises as a broad, dignified silhouette against the changing sky, its pale limestone walls emerging from a platform shaped by human presence since antiquity. The hill offered both strategic advantage and gentle slopes that tied it to earlier patterns of settlement across the Rioni Basin. Approaching the site, the familiar 11th century form, its cross-domed plan, balanced elevations, and sculpted arches, appears straightforward, while anchored in the chronicles of King Bagrat III. Yet the ground beneath tells a more intricate story. Foundation irregularities and scattered stone fragments embedded in soil, disturbed by centuries of collapse, repair, and neglect signal a deeper architectural past. Archaeology on the hill has uncovered traces of occupation stretching back to prehistoric times. Fragments of ceramics, faint hearts, and subtle outlines of structures whose relationship to the medieval cathedral remains uncertain. These earlier layers survive only in partial glimpses, yet they form a quiet substratum beneath the later monumental project. The cathedral's surviving fabric still bears the scars of its turbulent history. Variations in stone size and workmanship reveal multiple teams of masons, while evidence of damage from 17th century invasions and long periods of disrepair is visible in collapsed sections of the dome and upper walls. Restoration campaigns of the past century introduced new stone and reinforcement, their smooth surfaces contrasting sharply with the weathered medieval limestone. Rather than blending, these layers sit side by side, creating an architectural record where past and present remain visibly distinct. Inside, the floor level shifts subtly between areas reconstructed from archaeological clues and those preserved from earlier phases. Some stones are deeply worn, others freshly cut, placed according to structural necessity rather than continuity with lost medieval surfaces. Excavations beneath the nave uncovered foundation trenches whose irregular shapes suggest adjustments made to accommodate earlier stonework or uneven bedrock, though insufficient evidence survives to reconstruct the pre-11th century layout with certainty. Geological analysis of the limestone shows a mixture of quarry sources, some fine-grained, others coarse, indicating that materials were gathered from multiple locations, perhaps reflecting changes in supply, labor, or the extended timeline of construction and repair. The cathedral's decorative elements, capitals, reliefs, carved bands, vary in execution. Some motifs retain crisp definition, while others appear softened or reworked, implying involvement of different workshops or later interventions that alter their original clarity. Across the grounds lie displaced column fragments, broken architectural pieces, and stone slabs half buried in grass. Some derive from upper sections that collapsed long ago. Others may belong to adjacent buildings now almost entirely lost. Their scattered arrangement complicates attempts to reconstruct the earliest layout of the complex. Contradictions appear quietly in the archaeological narrative. Soil layers containing mixtures of medieval and early modern artifacts due to repeated disturbance, foundation stones whose placement suggests reuse from unknown earlier buildings, and isolated pockets of undisturbed stratigraphy too limited to offer definitive conclusions. Erosion along the plateau edges has removed both natural sediment and human-made debris, leaving behind a selective record shaped as much by geological forces as by human activity. Ground-penetrating surveys indicate anomalies beneath the modern courtyard, possible remnants of earlier walls or terraces, but their outlines are too faint to distinguish older structures from collapsed parts of the medieval cathedral. Inside the restored interior, light falling to the high windows illuminates the subtle interplay between surviving medieval stone surfaces and modern additions, their shadows cast differently across each. The acoustic qualities, once defined by the height of the original dome, have shifted with reconstruction, yet faint reverberations persist, absorbed differently by the older masonry. In these echoes and shifting patterns of light, Bagrati reveals itself not as a fixed monument, but as a layered architectural palimpsest, a structure shaped by devotion, destruction, renewal, and the long memory of the hill on which it stands. Evening draws across Kutaisi, and the cathedral's facade shifts from pale gold to muted gray. In this fading light, Bagrati stands as both monument and fragment, its present form shaped by an unbroken sequence of building, collapse, excavation, and reconstruction. The medieval history recorded in chronicles secures its place within Georgia's architectural lineage, yet beneath that certainty lies a quieter, less defined story. Earlier occupation hinted at only by scattered artifacts, irregular foundations, and faint structural traces woven into the hill itself. The cathedral occupies a threshold between what is known and what remains only partly understood. Its commanding position overlooking the valley reinforces the sense that its story, though well mapped in later centuries, is anchored in a landscape whose earliest chapters persist in understated clues. As twilight settles over the city, the structure gathers its layered history into silence, leaving open the possibility that buried, eroded, or overlooked traces may one day clarify the long habitation that shaped Shio-Mgvime Hill long before the cathedral rose upon it. High above the meeting point of the Archaeology and Mgvime rivers, the ruins of Armatsi fortress occupy a steep ridge where natural defensibility and political ambition converged over centuries. The approach from Skita's outskirts reveals the remains gradually, low stone alignments softened by seasonal runoff, then heavier fortification walls appearing as the ridge narrows, their basalt blocks fitted with confidence that reflects both technical skill and adaptation to the unstable terrain. Archaeological work shows that Armatsi served as a significant administrative and ceremonial center during the early Iberian monarchy in the 1st centuries BCE and CE. Yet its earliest phases survive only in fragments, pottery of varied origin, hearth remnants, irregular foundation trenches, all complicated by later construction, seismic disturbance, and medieval reuse. The Armasian script preserved the inscriptions found nearby, hints at a cultural sophistication extending beyond the visible ruins, but on the ridge itself the record is marked as much by absence as by survival. Collapsed terraces, missing walls, and eroded platforms imply that sections of the fortress may once have extended farther along the spur. Geological surveys reveal alternating layers of compacted soil and fractured bedrock, patterns that explain both the strategic placement of the fortress and the difficulties encountered by its builders. Some walls rest firmly on bedrock, while others show subtle settling, forcing ancient masons to adjust alignments in ways now perceptible only in the surviving courses. Architectural fragments, column bases, shaped stones, the remnants of what may have been towers, lie scattered across the slope, their positions altered by landslides or past repurposing, complicating attempts to reconstruct the original plan. Masonry studies suggest at least three major building phases: an early period marked by large, roughly dressed blocks, a classical or early medieval stage characterized by more regular ashlar, and later repairs using smaller stones and mixed mortars sourced from the surrounding hillsides. Yet contradictions persist. Some lower walls appear older than the pottery found beside them, while reused stones embedded in upper structures point to earlier contexts now vanished. Inside the citadel area, terraces hold traces of domestic and administrative life. Storage pits, compacted earthen floors, perhaps small workshops, though their functions remain speculative due to the limited survival of diagnostic materials. On the southern edge, the collapsed gate complex reveals strategic intent through its narrow entry passage and staggered walls, even as the absence of the superstructure prevents full understanding of its design. Across the broader Armazi Valley, burial grounds, shrines, and satellite settlements demonstrate the fortress's importance within a larger cultural landscape. Yet the precise relationship between these features and the ridgetop stronghold remains unclear, shaped by uneven preservation, centuries of disturbance, and agricultural activity that has erased or displaced surface evidence. Mixed soil deposits reflect cycles of destruction and rebuilding. Roman ceramics lying beside medieval metal scraps, collapsed masonry intertwined with natural sediment. Even the scale of the fortress remains open to interpretation, as vegetation conceals fallen perimeters, and remote sensing reveals anomalies suggesting additional structures buried under colluvium. As evening approaches and the valley fades into muted tones, the ridge takes on a quiet stillness. In this dim light, the Armazi ruins seem less like the remains of a single fortress, and more like exposed fragments of a much broader historical tapestry. The known chronology, anchored in early Iberian sources, is firm enough to place Armazi within Georgia's ancient state formation, yet the deeper origins suggested by pre-classical artifacts, reused stones, and ambiguous foundations remain partly hidden within the ridge's fractured geology. As darkness gathers along the river confluence, the site withdraws into its elevated perch, offering only glimpses of a past layered across centuries, still waiting for the conditions that might reveal its earliest chapters more clearly. Deep within a limestone gorge west of Mesquita, Shio-Mgvime Monastery emerges gradually along a narrowing valley where the river's subdued murmur and the enclosing cliffs create a solitude that seems to have attracted people long before the arrival of the 6th century ascetic Shio. The approach follows the base of sheer walls where the earliest structures appear modest: subterranean chambers, cave-hewn corridors, and the remains of early cells carved directly into the rock. Their form suggests a lineage of habitation shaped by quiet adaptation to natural shelter. Archaeological investigations on the upper terraces have uncovered pottery fragments, pieces of plaster flooring, and shallow hearths indicating occupation predating the organized monastic community, though erosion and continual rebuilding make the earliest phases difficult to isolate with confidence. The most prominent structure, the domed church of St. John the Baptist, rises from a sheltered platform where shifts in masonry color and texture reveal multiple building phases, marking the site's expansion from a compact hermitage into a major medieval monastery. Beneath the church and across nearby slopes, natural caves converted into chapels and burial spaces show soot-darkened ceilings and wall cuttings that testify to prolonged use. Whether the earliest occupants were solitary hermits or part of a small, organized community remains uncertain. Geological studies indicate that the gorge's limestone fractures predictably along bedding plains, forming natural cavities that early inhabitants enlarged using simple tools. This combination of natural shelter and workable stone likely contributed to the site's enduring appeal, even as centuries of rockfall, runoff, and seismic activity altered passageways and obscured traces of earlier layouts. Some caves preserve faint remnants of fresco, their pigments clinging to uneven surfaces where dampness and time have softened the outlines. In others, pits cut into floors may mark burial sites or storage spaces, though the scarcity of associated artifacts limits confident interpretation. Across the complex, the interplay between constructed and natural spaces is evident. Steps leading into widened caverns, niches carved into walls of varying hardness, and pathways adjusted repeatedly to accommodate rockfall or shifts in community needs. Later expansions added refectories, additional chapels, and defensive elements, layering new architecture over older cave systems. The archaeological record is marked by subtle contradictions. Walls rebuilt across different centuries display mismatched stonework. Terraces containing charcoal from early hearths also hold fragments from much later renovations, and some corridors that appear ancient may in fact reflect medieval or even early modern reshaping. The gorge itself contributes to this ambiguity. Erosion erases edges, while sediment carried by seasonal flows buries others, creating a constantly shifting surface that conceals as much as it reveals. As evening descends and the cliffs take on a muted blue, Shio-Mgvime retreats into shadow. The silence of the gorge deepens, and the monastery's layered past becomes almost palpable in the dimming air, a sequence of lives and structures shaped by devotion, practicality, and the sheltering embrace of stone. Its documented origins are secure, yet the hints of earlier habitation, scattered artifacts, and altered cave forms suggest a past that extends beyond written memory, waiting quietly in the gorge's recesses for whatever fragments time might still allow us to recover. Fragments of fresco survive in several of the Shio-Mgvime caves, thin slivers of pigment embedded in moisture-worn plaster, the last remnants of devotional programs now largely irrecoverable. Other spaces retain only the faintest outlines of niches, benches, or carved recesses whose original functions remain uncertain. Contradictions emerge quietly in the archaeological record. Certain upper chambers exhibit architectural shaping consistent with early medieval techniques, yet pottery found nearby points to later activity. Foundations beneath monastic buildings reveal alignments that do not correspond to the present plan, suggesting that earlier structures were absorbed, altered, or abandoned as the community expanded. The Cave of Shio, with its narrow entrance and descending corridor, preserves overlapping layers of plaster and stonework reflecting repeated phases of visitation and restoration. But centuries of devotional use, natural sediment buildup, and periodic clearing have fragmented its stratigraphy, obscuring its earliest form. Higher on the slope, terrace paths lead to auxiliary buildings, refectories, chapels, living quarters, where variations in masonry reveal episodic construction responding to shifts in monastic population, political conditions, and available resources. Some walls incorporate stones clearly reused from earlier phases, their tooling mismatched with surrounding blocks. The water system, fed by springs rising deeper in the gorge, includes rock-cut channels and clay-lined conduits whose chronology is difficult to establish due to intermittent rebuilding. Certain sections follow natural contours with remarkable precision. Others show evidence of collapse and improvisation, hinting at an evolving balance between monastic needs and the demanding hydrology of the valley. Written accounts emphasize the site's importance as a spiritual and cultural center, but the material record shows interruptions in occupation. Burned layers and collapsed structures suggest episodes of conflict or temporary retreat. Some cells contain undisturbed sediment indicating long periods of quiet. Others show mixed ceramics and irregular floors as signs of rapid turnover. Even within the main church, differences in mortar composition and coloration across arches point to repairs likely undertaken after seismic events, though the exact sequence is difficult to match with sparse records. As afternoon light narrows into the gorge, illuminating some facades, while leaving others in shadow, the site's layered past becomes more visible. A merging of natural caverns and human carving, structural adaptation, and spiritual continuity. The buildings appear almost absorbed into the cliffs, their outlines softened by weather and the paths between them shaped as much by erosion as by intentional planning. Shio-Mgvime endures as a place where documented monastic tradition rests atop a terrain shaped by earlier, less defined human use. As the last light fades and the river's sound deepens in the gorge, the monastery draws its long chronology inward, leaving only a muted suggestion that beneath its familiar religious history lie older chapters, trace and reused stones, hollowed passages, and faint carvings left by lives that predate the written record. High on a wooded ridge above the Alazani Valley, the Nekrisi archaeological complex unfolds in uneven layers of history, beginning with the quiet silhouette of its hilltop basilica and extending outward to terraces where faint stone alignments and scattered artifacts hint at much older habitation. Approached through forests of hornbeam and oak, the complex appears at first rooted firmly in early Christian history. 4th to 6th century churches, monastic residences, and defensive towers forming a recognizable ensemble. Yet the shifting ground and narrowing paths reveal subtler traces of pre-Christian use. Pottery smoothed by centuries of erosion, remnants of clay floors, shallow depressions that may once have anchored structures now lost to time. Archaeology indicates that the hills served as a focal point in antiquity, perhaps connected to settlement networks that spread across the fertile valley, though seasonal runoff and forest growth have blurred the earlier landscape. Within the monastic precinct, the basilica's masonry shows distinct construction phases, roughly dressed stones at the base giving way to more precise ashlar above, suggesting that builders adapted older foundations or reused earlier material rather than imposing a wholly new plan on untouched ground. Nearby, the smaller domed church reveals mortar textures and stone coloration distinct from the basilica, marking it as part of a later expansion. Excavations beneath its floor uncovered layers of charcoal, ceramics, and mixed soils whose chronology does not align neatly with either the earliest or latest phases, indicating that this part of the ridge served shifting purposes across generations. The tower standing slightly apart bears tool marks inconsistent with those of the basilica. Its stones show patterns of reuse that raise the possibility that the structure predates the monastic complex or was rebuilt from an earlier watchpoint overlooking the valley. Geological studies reveal alternating bands of compacted clay and fractured limestone, a combination that both aided and constrained ancient builders. Some terraces remain firm where bedrock lies close to the surface. Others have slipped over time, tilting walls and producing irregular alignments visible in surviving architecture. Beyond the main buildings, partially buried walls and terraces emerge from the forest undergrowth. Their placement suggests deliberate organization, but their construction varies from rough fieldstone to more refined masonry, complicating efforts to assign them to a single cultural horizon. Ceramic fragments from these outlying areas span several centuries, their stylistic variety indicating repeated use of the ridge for habitation, agriculture, or ritual activity. Inside the basilica, remnant of plaster and faint repainting reveal layers of artistic programs, some overwritten or abandoned as the monastic community adapted to shifting theological or political circumstances. Stone-lined channels nearby hint at water management systems, though their partial collapse leaves uncertain whether they date to the monastic period or earlier occupations dependent on seasonal springs. Contradictions surface gently throughout the site. Foundation stones misalign with the structures above them, soil layers containing mixed materials from different centuries due to repeated building, abandonment, and vegetation growth, walls that bridge distinct architectural traditions, obscuring whether they represent continuity or reuse. In caves near the ridge, soot marks and carved recesses suggest hermetic dwellings or small shelters predating the monastery, though the absence of diagnostic artifacts prevents firm identification. Centuries of terracing and natural erosion have shaped the hillside into a mosaic of surfaces, making it difficult to distinguish where domestic, monastic, and possibly ritual spaces once began or ended. As the sun drops behind the mountains and the Alazani Valley fades into deepening blue, the Nekrisi complex settles into a quiet presence. Its clustered churches and scattered ruins appear both cohesive and incomplete, a constellation of structures anchored in early Christian history, yet surrounded by deeper, more ambiguous traces of human activity. In the stillness of evening, the ridge holds its chronology lightly, offering glimpses of long habitation without revealing the full extent of its earliest chapters. Beneath the familiar outlines of its churches and towers, older stories linger, shaped by communities whose presence survives only in faint but persistent marks across the slope above the valley. Below the main ridge of Nekrisi, the terrain descends into a series of folded terraces where human presence lingers only in scattered material traces. Broken ceramics, burnt soil patches, and fragments of architectural stone shaped deliberately to be natural, yet too isolated to reconstruct with confidence. These terraces form a transitional zone between the core monastic precinct and the wider hillside, where the boundaries between sacred space, domestic life, and seasonal activity remain blurred. In some areas, low retaining walls appear beneath layers of leaf fall and soil accumulation. Their stones, mismatched in size and tooling, suggest multiple repair cycles that may have extended across centuries. Yet the limited stratigraphic integrity of these deposits makes it difficult to determine whether they supported agricultural activity, small dwellings, or ritual structures later replaced by Christian buildings. What remains is a palimpsest of shifting uses shaped by the valley's economic rhythms and the ridge's strategic vantage. Farther downslope, excavation trenches reveal narrow pathways carved into the clay-rich soil, traces that may represent early access routes connecting the ridge to settlements in the Alizani Plain. These paths show alternating patches of compacted earth and loose stone, implying phases of maintenance and abandonment. In certain segments, wheel ruts appear faintly beneath the forest humus. Though without associated artifacts, it remains uncertain whether they belong to medieval transport or older movements of people and livestock. The steepness of the slope suggests that trade or pilgrimage routes likely skirted the hill rather than rising directly to its summit. Yet the presence of these footprints of passage indicates that the ridge was never truly isolated. Instead, it sat at the edge of a wider network of interaction whose traces have been thinned by erosion and vegetation. Higher along the ridge, patches of disturbed soil containing charcoal and animal bone fragments point to temporary encampments or work sites where quarrying or agricultural preparation may have occurred. Geological surveys identify outcrops of workable limestone near these locations, and tool marks on certain exposed surfaces imply that ancient builders may have extracted stone directly from a hillside for construction in the monastic complex. However, the lack of consistent debris piles or quarry fronts complicates the picture. It is possible that stone extraction occurred only intermittently, or that earlier quarry scars were later obscured by landslides and vegetation growth. Still, these subtle geological traces underscore a relationship between the monastery and its landscape that was resource-driven as much as devotional. Fragments of metal objects, nails, buckles, fishing hooks, have been recovered from the middle terraces, albeit in small and widely dispersed quantities. Their placement suggests episodes of domestic activity rather than concentrated workshop production. In some cases, the corrosion patterns indicate prolonged exposure before burial, implying that these objects may have belonged to short-term occupants or travelers who passed through the area without leaving more permanent structures. Such finds reinforce the impression that the ridge supported fluctuating populations long before the monastic community formalized its presence, with the hillside functioning at times as a lookout, at others as a transient shelter, and at others still as a quiet site of agricultural labor tied to nearby settlements. The deeper soil layers hold their own complexities. Mixed deposits containing early Christian ceramics beside Iron Age fragments reveal centuries of disturbance, whether through natural slope movement, root penetration, or repeated human excavation. In one trench, archaeologists identified a compacted layer of ash and burnt clay, though no associated hearth or architectural feature survived. Its isolated presence hints an event, perhaps a fire used for clearing vegetation or a ritual act performed in an open setting, but without further evidence, interpretation remains speculative. Other layers contain pebbled surfaces that may represent outdoor flooring, yet the absence of surrounding structural elements makes it unclear whether these belong to small open-air shrines, agricultural platforms, or temporary workspaces. In the upper sectors of the complex, the preserved churches and defensive structures reveal their own internal ambiguities. Walls once thought to belong to a single building phase have, upon closer examination, yielded variations in mortar composition and stone-cutting techniques, pointing to a more staggered construction history than previously assumed. Windows sealed long ago appear slightly misaligned with their interior reveals, suggesting structural shifts or expansions that alter the geometry of the original spaces. In some corners, plaster separations expose outlines of earlier architectural forms, arched niches and framed recesses now hidden behind later walls, indicating that the buildings evolved through a process of adaptation rather than a single cohesive plan. Inside the basilica, small cavities near the foundation reveal pockets of soil containing imported ceramics, likely brought to site during its height as a monastic center. The presence of such material suggests connections to trade networks extending across eastern Georgia and perhaps beyond. Yet the limited quantity of these finds indicates that the monastery was not a major commercial hub, but a modest participant in regional exchange. Still, the presence of foreign goods hints at the mobility of ideas and people who visited or passed through complex, leaving behind subtle markers of wider cultural interaction. South of the main church, aerial surveys have detected faint linear depressions in the ground, possible traces of fences or boundary markers that once delineated agricultural plots or sacred precincts. Their alignment does not match the known medieval enclosure walls, implying an earlier system of territorial organization. Yet without excavated material to anchor them chronologically, these features float between interpretive possibilities. They may represent prehistoric field systems, early Christian boundaries, or modifications introduced during later periods of decline when the site's occupation thinned and reconfigured. Near the eastern slope, a cluster of shallow pits filled with pottery sherds and animal bones suggests refused disposal or food preparation zones. However, the irregular shapes and mixed fill point to multiple episodes of use, possibly spanning centuries. Some pits contain fragments of glass vessels, which appear inconsistent with the monastic ascetic lifestyle commonly described in textual sources. This disparity suggests either brief periods of non-monastic habitation, visiting groups with different material customs, or a more complex internal economy within the community itself, one that may have allowed for a wider range of activities than the written record implies. The caves scattered along the ridge present their own interpretive challenges. Some contain soot layers indicating prolonged use, yet others remain strikingly clean, as though abandoned early or never fully inhabited. Carved recesses and low benches appear in many of them, but without associated artifacts their functions remain open. They may have served as hermitages, storage spaces, small chapels, or even seasonal shelters used by shepherds long before the Christian period. The ambiguity reflects both the cave's natural durability and the ease with which successive occupants could reshape them, leaving behind overlapping traces that resist clear chronological sequencing. As the sun sinks behind the mountains and shadows lengthen across the valley, the Nekrisi complex takes on a quiet, suspended quality. Its monuments, some preserved, others eroded into bare outlines, stand amid a landscape whose deeper layers remain only partially exposed. The ridge feels inhabited not only by its visible remains, but by the countless traces that lie just beneath the surface. Reused stones, faint terrace lines, scattered sherds, misaligned foundations, and pockets of soil that once held the rhythms of lives now irretrievable. In this dimming light, the site reveals itself as neither wholly understood nor wholly mysterious, but as a place where history survives in uneven intervals, shaped by both continuity and rupture. It remains open to the possibility that future excavation, shifting terrain, or a simple chance may uncover new fragments capable of expanding or reconfiguring its earliest chapters.